Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining from. I'm Mark Segal, founder and CEO of ESG Today. And it's great to welcome you to today's webinar called Beyond Disclosure, Turning Climate Risk into Strategic Advantage. And to kick off, we see more frequent extreme weather events, growing supply chain disruptions, and tightening regulations are making it clear that climate risk is not a future issue, it's a business challenge that is here now. Today's discussion is about how companies are responding, not just to stay compliant, but to build resilience and to turn risk into a strategic advantage. This session is brought to you by Schneider Electric's sustainability business, which includes EcoAct, a climate and sustainability consultancy that became part of Schneider in 2023. Together, they support organizations in managing energy, decarbonization, and climate risk, helping businesses navigate both regulatory complexity and long-term transition planning. We'll hear from two professionals who work directly with organizations navigating this landscape. First, we have Lindsey Edelman, part of the sustainability team at Schneider Electric, where she focuses on climate risk strategy across the Americas. She has a background in finance and works closely with companies on assessing climate risks and aligning with evolving disclosure frameworks. Joining her is Maria Sunyer, managing consultant with EcoAct. Maria helps organizations understand their climate risks and develop resilient strategies, bringing a practical, science-informed perspective to her work with businesses across different sectors. Just a quick housekeeping note before we go on. We're hoping to have time for a Q&A on today's webinar. So if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to write them in the comments section, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. Anyways, with all that out of the way, let's kick off the webinar with today's guests. So starting with our first question, we've seen over 150 extreme weather events in 2024 alone, and new regulations like CSRD, IFRS 2, and California's SB 261 are ramping up pressure. Why is 2025 being seen as a critical juncture for climate risk, and how should businesses recalibrate their risk strategies in response to this moment? I'll put this out to both of you, but let's start with Lindsey.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, absolutely. So the regulations you just mentioned are what I perceive to be a delayed, I hope that's not too controversial, delayed public response to the climate crisis. So the environmentalists to me and saying, finally, we're seeing some momentum, which is fantastic, but the societal urgency is still very much there, and it's still mounting, right? And it's going to continue to take mitigative and adaptive actions toward a more resilient future. And so our local and socioeconomic and environmental futures are inextricably linked to, the folks on the line, your companies, and what you do and what you don't do, right? So we're depending on that connection here. And we're all quite aware, I think, of the current impacts of climate change. We've in our local, geographies, in our local communities, and those around the world, we know what's happening. We know what's coming. Just more frequent and intense events of the same. When I was reflecting on this, I thought about this quote from a Greek Stoic philosopher. Not that I follow much philosophy, but we've all heard this. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. And I think about that a lot. And I thought that this is quite relevant here. Is how do we respond? How do we respond? How do my clients respond? How do your companies respond? What do we do about this? Right. So this year, like Mark, like you said, this year is a critical juncture. 2025 is an opportunity to recenter your risk management within your organization to intentionally include climate-related issues, physical, transition, the opportunities, all of it. Right, so when we're recalibrating our risk strategies in response to this moment, it's making sure your ERM program governance is current. Does it include all of the climate-related issues that could affect your business? Are your assessments also current? Do they cover your operations? Do they cover your value chain? Many times when folks are starting out, we just start with operations. So definitely would encourage you to check, the scope and the breadth of your assessments. And have you had a hard look at how the future could impact your business model? So thinking about the future of how you're looking to evolve and reach and contribute impact to your consumers. And disclosure plays a huge role in this, but because our economic functionality, right, it depends on it. The investors depend on that. But when it comes down to it, we need to start moving into risk management and operationalizing mitigation and adaptation actions. Also,
Great. Thanks. So Maria, over to you. If you
Thanks, Mark. And yeah, thanks for having me here today. So I guess it's a great question. I think one thing that comes to mind to add to what Lindsey mentioned, I think one point that makes 2025 a critical year is that we saw 2024 just being the first year where we went over that 1.5 degree threshold, which is something that, you know, we know, like current science, like that's where, like beyond that, we're really going to start seeing the catastrophic impact from climate change, if I can say it this way. So I think that was a bit of a wake-up call for everyone. It's like, it's not something we need to plan for the future. It's not something we can wait and see what happens. And mitigation is not enough. Like, it's happening now. We've been impacted, as you and Lindsey have mentioned, and the time to really plan and act is now. We've seen a similar line by those delay regulations, as Lindsey put it. And I think one nice thing that we also see now is that these frameworks that we've seen in the last years are really starting to align, really starting to have like a common message, a common expectation, and a clear guidance on what companies need to do, what someone really needs to look at to make sure that companies prepare for both the physical and transition risk, and that's well embedded. So I think that signal that we have the right frameworks and regulation that's finally in place and it's here to stay. I think that's making 2025 a bit of a shift year where we just really take this properly serious. And I guess that kind of links to where I think companies need to start shifting their focus in terms of disclosure. It's not a tick box exercise, not something quick to do. It's not something that the sustainability team does and that's it. Is a business, across departments task. It really needs to be properly embedded. It needs to be part of the risk management, and it's a strategic task. You need to understand how climate change is impacting you now and in the future to make sure that the business is actually resilient to this. So I think these are, to me, the key points that make 2025 a critical year.
Oh, thank you. Great. Lindsey, from your view, how are transition risks like regulation and investor pressure shaping business strategy today?
No, that's a good question. That's been one of the huge focus areas for the last year and a half or so, especially 4.5 months or 5 months. And so the policy momentum I mentioned earlier, and that Mark, you're alluding to, it has been really definitional for some of our clients, where they've had trouble getting this topic, getting this concept in front of the leadership team, in front of the board, and saying, hey, we've been wanting to do this for a long time, but we've been having a little bit of trouble with that, and now the regulations, it really gives them a leg up. It gives them a foundation. The board is kind of a no-brainer. For some of our other clients, it's been almost restrictive, where they had a really robust strategy. They had built it around this whole narrative that was pertinent to their team, their employees and consumers, and they're like, this is us, right? And now there are these regulations that say, you have to do these things in this way. And I was saying, well, that's going to disrupt the plan that I had, right? But in both examples, in every instance that we've seen with our clients, it's raising the top of climate change to the board and the C-suite. So we know decision makers are actually paying attention. I can tell you that their vocabulary, their comprehension around this has increased dramatically, which is fantastic to have that level of buy-in, or at least awareness. It's moving towards buy-in. And so the board is asking, so what are we doing then? Is it enough? Have we done enough? Do we need to do more? And my favorite question, how much does it cost? And so what's happening in practice is that companies are reviewing what they have to do per the regulation and in the eyes of their investors, in the event they have shareholder resolutions, right? So companies are being a little bit more cautious, which is interesting. And I think that has to do with the regulatory ambiguity in this space, also years of CDP. So that I think they're trying to take, even in the midst of the regulation, taking a little bit of that narrative back and saying, what makes sense for me? What makes sense for our company's vision? Does it include our decarbonization targets that we may have already set? We've already charted maybe some of our transition. Let's try to fit this in to a strategy that we can kind of take ownership of and make sure every dollar, matters. It's not just saying, oh, my peer did this, so I should do it too, because that might not necessarily really make sense for your business. So we have seen more maturity in the market, but not so much maturity that everyone has it figured out. We're very far from that. There's still a lot of ground to cover, and we are seeing that movement to define business strategy in the context of the regulation, but also how it makes sense for the specific company context.
Thanks, Lindsey. So Maria, just to zoom in a little more on the physical climate side, on the physical risk, how can companies better assess and map their exposure to physical climate risks, especially across global supply chains?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I guess it links quite nicely with your introduction. So we've seen an increased number of extreme weather events, 150 just in 2024. So it's actually really important for companies to understand their physical risks now and in the future under different scenarios. The better way, I guess, to assess exposure is making sure that companies start to move beyond that kind of high-level estimates of, yeah, maybe my exposure to flooding is high, medium, low, kind of that level of like scoring, to something that's been more quantitative in the terms of really understanding which type of events are creating damage, how much more frequent or intense they might be in the future, because having that more detailed information and understanding of the type of events and the frequency that they might happen to which of your sites really helps start to plan and understand what you need to do to respond. So that's, I guess, one step is moving away from just high-level estimates to really starting to understand what type of events. And then the other thing I would say is also embrace uncertainty. That's not something that people kind of like, and it's seen as a negative thing. But actually, when we think about climate change and future climate, we don't know exactly how that's going to look like. That's why we have different scenarios. That's why we have models that kind of run multiple times to really try to project how the climate look like. It's not a prediction. So really try to understand what's the range of this uncertainty, how the future might look like within a range of values, because that will make sure that then any decisions that are being taken, taking into account this different range of values, are robust and make sense for your business. So I think that's something that companies need to kind of start thinking about, is that kind of more detailed estimates and uncertainty. And then to touch on the point that you made on supply chain, I think that's where there needs to be an increased focus. There's been lots of focus on direct operations. I think Lindsey mentioned earlier, starting to really understand how your supply chain might be impacted is the next step. That's been more tricky because it's difficult to get information, detailed information in your supply chain. You know, where are the key manufacturing plants being located? What are the routes? How's the flexibility and redundancy? That's information that might be difficult to get. So I think that's where we need to start kind of exploring that collaboration, being able to have that conversation with suppliers, understanding how prepared are they, what are they doing to prepare, to really start to understand the resilience of your supply chain to physical risk. So it's a combination of more focus on direct operations, detailed estimates, and really kind of that collaboration with your suppliers where needed.
Okay, so given that need, I mean, what tools or methods are most effective for identifying climate risks across operations or value chains?
Yeah, so I guess there is not a unique best tool or method. That will depend on the level of maturity and the journey that each business is at the stage. One thing I guess to touch on is that whatever that method or tool there is, and we've seen an increasing number of tools in the market that kind of offer physical risk solutions, I think there are a few things to take into account, I would say. One is that any risk estimate need to cover all the key components of risk. So not only focusing on how is the climate going to change that exposure part, but also understanding for each of your sites, how prepared are they? Where is the vulnerability with company-specific data, not just sector-specific data? It needs to be really tailored to each business, because each business is different and each business might be preparing or prepared in a different way. Understanding that adaptive capacity, kind of those budgets available for adaptation and so on. So any tool or method that's used needs to cover all the components of risk, have company-specific data, be able to communicate uncertainty, as I mentioned earlier, and kind of really avoid that kind of black box approach to estimating physical risk. It's not only about one number, but it's understanding this number, where it comes from, what's uncertainty, and how I use this to make decisions to enhance resilience.
Okay, and again, not to put you too much on the spot, but moving on beyond just just managing risk, like can you share an example where physical risk adaptation directly improved resilience or business continuity?
Yeah, that's a question, and I like it because I guess there's not a clear answer, or maybe there's an answer with lots of examples. It's actually difficult to answer because I think with adaptation and with resilience to physical risks, it's very difficult to see when it works. So when a company has put the right measures in place, I don't know, maybe the buildings are better equipped to cope with like extreme temperatures, or the staff knows what to do in these events, or well prepared for flooding. It's difficult to quantify what the benefit has been of that because nothing has happened. And the business, the site has been resilient to that event. It's very easy to see when it fails, when a business is not well prepared or a site is not prepared and it suffers the damage from flooding, from heat waves, water stress, and so on. But we have seen examples of where businesses are starting to prepare, starting to implement these measures, and that might cover resilience in design. So when you start thinking about a new site, a new building, making sure you don't just plan for past climate, which is what traditionally has been done, but starting to plan for future climate. So make a building, a system, and infrastructure that is able to cope with future temperatures, future precipitation, future flood. We've also seen great examples of using nature-based solutions to solve with to help manage physical risks. So managing floods, managing increasing temperatures, while also contributing with like biodiversity benefits and even carbon reductions. And I would say, especially in relation to these measures, maybe it's not something that the business has done in isolation to the context where they are, but it's something that kind of, when it works best, is maybe in collaboration and partnership with the local authority. And that's important because you don't just want to make sure that my site is protected and nothing around it. You want kind of the whole system where your site depends on, like the transport, energy, to be functioning, so your business and your site can continue to function. So there's been examples here and there, but hopefully more to be seen in this critical year, I guess.
Thanks. So now just switching focus a little to everyone's favorite topic, let's talk about disclosure a little bit. Like Murray, I'll give you a little bit of a break. So Lindsey, with CSRD, ISSB, you got the California climate laws, kicking in. What's the first move for companies looking to get ahead, and what challenges should they prepare for on this front?
Thanks, Mark. It's a great question. It's all we talk about. Not all we talk about. It's a lot of what we talk about, right? So the companies that we're working with, I think there's an assumption like, oh, okay, well, I have business in California, so therefore California applies to me, which effectively is true. But there's these very specific definitions around doing business in California, or all the requirements for CSRD. There's an assumption of I might be, fit under this framework, but in some cases you don't. In some cases you don't think you do, and you actually do. And it's not very clear. And I would highly recommend if you're just starting out and you haven't had your legal team involved in this, that's what the first step is, just validating your assumptions, validating which regional regulations that your publications need to be aligned to. It's the first thing. And there's an urgency around this, right? Because some of the milestones coming up are quite soon. We have less than 7 months now to respond to or publish your report for California SB 219-261. So it's coming quite soon. So if you haven't started, best of luck there. You can still do it. There's still time, and there's help out there as well for you. But to prepare for these publications, I would suggest, to gather what you've done to date and make some quick decisions as much as humanly possible about your capabilities to disclose in the near term. Do you have information? Do you have something, right? Because in some cases you're allowed to use some omission statements, but if this year is just about getting something enough out there, getting the foundation in place within your organization from a strategic standpoint, a risk management standpoint, but also your disclosure standpoint, because you're looking to likely minimize compliance-related fines and reputational risks of non-disclosure. That's generally been the theme of when I talk to clients. That's been kind of the focus. But it's not the end, right? This is just the very beginning. This is kind of saying, hey, we haven't started yet. How do we get through this year? But when we're looking to get ahead, which is really the question, what you do for this year, what you do for the first year is not likely going to cut it for the next year. We don't know what's going to happen with some of these regulations, but we can anticipate, and in all scenario analysis work, right? We're planning for the worst, right? We want to prepare for what could happen. We don't want to hope for the best, because obviously that's not the context of business resiliency. So I would recommend, what do you need to mature in this space? Do you need to expand your scope? Do you need to deepen your analysis of climate-related risks and opportunities? Have you assessed impacts? Have you done the analysis, but now you need to think critically about how you're actually going to implement the mitigation activities and realization strategies? Do you know you've already done that? You know what you need to do, but you haven't actually started the implementation process. You also maybe haven't thought about monitoring these risks on an ongoing basis. You've done it once, but have you done it 2-3 times? And all of these things are opportunities to mature within your organization, to have an enhanced sense of control as much as humanly possible, right? So the next few years, I think we will see some settling in the disclosure scene, and maybe that's wishful thinking. But I really do think we're going to see some settling, because there's been just so very much change. And so I think the challenge that we have to prepare for is, how do we keep our disclosures? How do we keep our program fresh and current? How do we keep up with structural changes like acquisitions? So many of my clients are, buying other entities, like changing this. That's really difficult, I think, when we're trying to assess organizational wide risk. We did it for this half of the business, now we acquired a business that's just as big, and maybe they haven't done anything, so now you have to expand, so now we have to keep up with that. Continuing to push yourselves with the maturity. You're like, oh, I just finished this project, it was so hard, I'm gonna take a break. And now that break turns into 2 years, and now you have to basically start over again. So I think that's a challenge that we have to prepare for. I think we also have to prepare for trying to find ways to get in front of leadership, trying to find ways to earmark that budget for the ongoing investment that may be needed for some of these resilience measures. So those are some of the challenges that I think I'm keeping on in my mind, as how we're working with our clients to try to navigate some of these challenges coming our way.
So, with all that happening, and like you said, with everyone trying to navigate, and, companies at different levels and all that, do you think there's a shift happening where disclosure can be seen not just as compliance, but actually become a strategic advantage?
I think we're starting to see that more and more. I think in the last few years, people were just so focused on getting the disclosure out there. They weren't as focused on the strategic aspect, but I think that's shifting now. And really, that was the whole point of TCFD, in my opinion, right? It was getting investors the information they need to make informed decisions, right? And if they're making informed decisions, they're making informed decisions on how to allocate capital. And that allocation of capital should fund, economic direction, which is really quite exciting. And so the climate risk disclosure in this space has become much more common, much more uniform, thanks to the work that the TCFD led and now the ISSB has taken up. And so as the pool of companies disclosing upon their climate-related risks and strategies expands, I do think the actual content will be leveraged with more intentionality and has the capability to inform economic advantage. So what I mean by that, I think it's going to hopefully spur, again, maybe wishful thinking, hopefully spur co-opetition when it comes to mitigation adaptation activities. There is a huge opportunity. I think Maria talked about collaboration with suppliers. So even within your value chain, there's a huge opportunity to collaborate. CDP asks that every year. If you're a responder, do you want to collaborate with your suppliers? Do you have an idea? That sort of thing. And when it comes to opportunities, there are very real product and service and market opportunities that can help to capitalize on first mover or perceived first mover advantage. So as if investors are seeing this for the first time, an announcement around a product or service that is kind of taking advantage of a climate opportunity, that might be a signal to them to invest, right? Some other company might have done this, but if they haven't disclosed it because they, thought it was too early, they might be missing out on this opportunity. So not to say to disclose something that you're not ready to disclose, but I think there's an opportunity to get out there sooner because there are rewards out there, I think, when you do that. And in some cases, consumers have spoken. They know what they want, and they know what they want from you and from those companies. And these disclosures help it make it much more clear to them what companies are really doing. As a consumer, I know, and maybe because I'm in the space, but I know that there's much more due diligence that goes into a 10K, that goes into an annual report, that goes into maybe a product advertisement, and maybe just something I get in the mail, right? So I'm much more willing to check and have faith and confidence in something that I'm going to see in an annual report or a 10K, to demonstrate, yes, I am going to buy from this company versus this other company. So absolutely, I do expect strategic competition to pick up with a more level playing field around disclosure.
Great. I mean, this is such a great discussion. We could go on like forever. I think we should go to Q&A like soon, but before we do, just to put both of you on the spot, it'd be great from hearing from you guys. Each of you, if you had one piece of advice for a company just starting out here, what would it be? And Marie, I'll start with you. I'll give Lindsey a break for a minute.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, I guess the piece of advice I would give is like, do get started. Obviously you're just starting, but like that's a really good step to do, an important one. I would say, obviously you won't be able to do everything in the first year. I think Lindsey alluded to that. So it's about like really make a plan on what can you achieve in this first year. What will you be then doing next year? This is a continuous, not something that you'll do once and you'll forget for 5 years and then look back at it. It's important, it's critical, it affects business and financial risk. So proper planning, proper budget allocation, and proper engagement within the business is critical for success here. So I think we mentioned it's not something that one person within your sustainability team is going to do. It needs involvement from your legal team, from your risk team, from your finance team, and it needs to be owned by everyone. The other quick piece of advice, if I can, I know we're running out of time, could be do not look at climate risk as one topic in isolation. It needs to be part of your wider risk management process. It needs to be integrated within that process, and it also needs to be aligned with your climate strategy. So it's not one piece of work in isolation that's done every 5 years by one person in the team. It needs to be properly integrated, and I think that leads to success.
Well, jump in. So
Sorry,
I think
over to you, Lindsey. Sorry.
Maria covered a lot of it. So for companies just starting out, just be transparent and recognize what we're going through, right? We're going through, and you're leading through a period of ambiguity. And all I think you need to know is that the next step that you're taking is one that's forward, right? We want to make sure that if we're investing money into this and if we're investing in a project, that we're going in a direction that makes sense, that will pay off in some way, either for compliance or will have strategic value. If it has either, I think that's a forward step. You're going to have information that's going to be useful to your organization in some way. So to do that, conceptually jotting down everything you know about your organization's climate drivers. Why are you doing this? If you know why, that makes so much to come so much easier, right? From compliance to strategy to risk management. If you know why, if you know what matters to your leaders, to your employees, to your consumers, that just helps so much to contextualize the reasons for investing and the reasons for moving and taking action, right? If you know what you've done and what you haven't done, who your deciders are and who the doers are, you've got the foundation really set. You might not know the answers to all those questions. They sound simple, but sometimes they actually do take some time to put together. So if you need some help, I think that's okay too. But from there, you'll have a much clearer picture of what you really need to do. If your driver is compliance, maybe regulatory gap assessment. But if it's strategy, right, it might look a little bit different, but just be pragmatic, rank the activities in order of priority, and you can start to, craft the vision associated with that and understand what can you accomplish in the near term and what do you need help with. And that's a quick decision that needs to probably be made in the next couple of months, because as we talked about, in some cases, if it's California as your driver, you don't have that much time. So we're talking about some pretty quick decisions here. And from there, you can chart that long-term strategy. You have time to do that, but starting out, it's just find your people. This is a topic, like Maria said, find your team. This is a transversal topic. It shouldn't fall on any one person. If it is, there should be people within the organization that this is really should be part of their job as well. So I'd say work together to do this, right? Use the buddy system.
Okay, that's great. I think we have time for a short Q&A. So feel free to ask questions in the comment section. We already have several, so we'll get to as many as we can in the time that we have. So let me start out. I'll throw these out for either of you. It might be pretty obvious who should jump on it, but maybe not. We'll see. Let me start. So first question: how do you actually get leadership buy-in to treat climate risk as more than just a reporting requirement?
Maria, do you want to go first? Or
You can go first.
I was going to say, in my experience, usually leadership tends, if there's any sort of hesitancy, once they see a peer benchmarking, I think people are like, oh, I've seen enough peer benchmarking. I know exactly where I sit. I know that which companies have SBT targets. I know which companies do CDP, but that's not exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a specific peer benchmarking around IFRS S2 or the CSRD topics, right? Understanding exactly what companies are doing from a strategic standpoint and a disclosure standpoint with a very narrow focus on climate risk. And typically when we walk through that, they're like, oh, we haven't done as much as we thought we did. We might have targets, but we don't have all of these other things. And it's also quite exciting to see their peers kind of strewn out on a graph. And we get a lot of interest and excitement and engagement around that. So that tends to be an exercise to get them out of the compliance mindset of, oh, well, how are they actually adding value in their value chain around this? Because we can kind of start to bring some examples to life.
Yeah, and then I guess what I would add, what I've seen that kind of helps that kind of final convincing is really understanding those financial impacts. I think when talking about risk, sometimes we don't put that kind of monetary value on it. And I think that makes it difficult to understand what's the exact magnitude and what that could mean. People tend to respond better when you say, like, could be the financial impact on the business. This is the cost of inaction. And this is how much it would cost to act and the benefits of it. And then the case is clear. Like it just makes sense to prepare. It makes sense to understand. So being able to put those figures in front of the board, in front of leadership, really helps make the case for the decision and for the investment that the company needs to do to prepare now, but like to save a lot and benefit from the opportunities in a couple of years.
Okay, great. I think we can probably do a couple more. Here's one. How can companies estimate potential financial impacts of future climate events?
I'll maybe get started.
Yeah,
kind of
I was going to say that.
Yeah. So I think it really depends to which risk we're looking at. I think it's a slightly different approach to physical and transition risk. If we think about physical risk, then it's really understanding what downtime would mean for you, what's the lost revenue, what's the value of your assets that could be impacted. And it's really not more complicated, if I can put it that way. I get myself out on a job. It's not more complicated than really merging that understanding that the company has on their business and the cost that it takes to run it and the implications of not being able to run as business as usual, mixed with the climate information that we have. So mix on like how much more often these things are going to happen, what's the intensity, and how many days disruption that could cause. That's how we can get to financial impacts on physical risk. On transition, then it really depends on the risk. Like it's not the same to calculate a financial impact from a reputation type of risk than from a carbon or energy pricing. So I think that's really specific to the context and the risk that we're looking at.
Okay, great. Here's one just on the opportunity front, which I think is like a kind of our the theme that we were moving towards. This is a great question. What questions should I be asking people in other business functions to help identify opportunities to consider climate risk as part of their scope? That's a great question.
To identify opportunities as part of their scope. Absolutely. So it's kind of building your team. And when we think about the different departments that we typically engage, typically this starts and has always started for some reason with, I mean, I think we know why, the ESG or the sustainability teams, right? And it comes to them first because of the topic. However, so for instance, it's a CDP survey, if it's TCFD recommendations, now IFRS S2 or CDSB, or that, you know, they see sustainability and like, okay, sustainability team, you got this, right? And you're like, oh no, that's much too broad. We're going to need data from everybody. So we definitely need to include, you know, finance and real estate. And I think articulating what data we need and why, who are the decision makers, for instance, finance, if this is going to go into an annual report, they're going to want to look at this. You know, legal is also going to want to look at it. The strategy team is probably going to want to look at this because it's going to be impacting a future statement. You're going to be talking about that element of the disclosure in a future sense, and it needs to be validated with those teams first. And if you say, hey, I'm going to put this in the disclosure, say, hey, hold up, wait, I want to take a look at it first. So I think sometimes, you know, if you start something, for instance, if you start painting a room and your partner's like, no, I want to make sure, you know, it's all done right. Sometimes just starting something will help pull people in because they want to be engaged. And if they don't, I think it's articulating the value of saying, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. What would you suggest? For instance, the ERM, the Enterprise Risk Management team, likely will have some things to say around how to structure an engagement. How would we use the outputs? Because they're going to end up needing to use that for board level presentations and awareness mechanisms. So not very specific questions, but I think articulating the value, saying you're going to start something, they'll probably get pulled in pretty quickly.
Okay, great. You guys have time for one more? We actually have like 10 more, but I don't think we can get to everything. But you know, like I'll forward the other questions to the panelists after, so that you guys can go look at it, because they're actually they're actually really interesting, cover a lot of ground. And maybe we should have made this like an hour and a half. So just to go like you know, something that may have been on people's minds lately. I may have heard a little bit about this. Are you seeing any pushback or cancellations as a result of President Trump's policies?
Guess I should take that as
yes.
President of the United States representative. So for SE, so the only cancellation or like fully on hold disclosure ruling that we had was the SEC proposed ruling. And that's been completely kind of put on hold for perpetuity. And I don't think that's likely to come back in the next 4 years. Let's see what happens after the next 4 years. So for all of my clients and for us, we've kind of said, let's not worry about that. That's not likely going to be a valid, you know, avenue for this year at the federal level. But we're continuing to see the legislation and the reviews that are going over around California. You know, there's still going to court around some of these things, but every time the court has upheld the direction and the regulation around California SB 261 / 219. And so there has been no indication that that's really going anywhere, anytime, at least this year. So we haven't seen the administration affect at the federal level affect the state level regulation. In fact, I think there's still movement around other states like New York and others that are pushing up new regulation, are still kind of trying to insert that. So short answer is not a whole lot. Federal level, absolutely. But when I've been to events and hearing politicians speak about this, you know, they're important people who dedicate their lives to navigating the policy space and are really trying to work on this on our behalf. So as private companies, and I say private, so in the private space, but maybe you're a public company or what have you, you can continue to take action and make meaningful change within the economy. That's what's going to drive progress outside of whatever happens at the policy space. And we saw that during his last administration as well, that the private companies really stood up and continued to push forward.
Okay, fantastic. Guys, we're just about out of time. There's a lot more questions, but I think we have to cut it off here. Anyways, let me just thank Lindsey Maria for just a fascinating discussion. It was, it was really great, so interesting and super timely. And I'm guessing if we have this again in a few months, all the answers will be a little bit different, and so looking forward to that. We'll send out a link to everybody who joined today with a recording of today's webinar, which will also be available shortly on the resources page on ESG Today. So again, thanks Lindsey and Maria, and thanks everybody else, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Mark.